Have you ever had any food go rancid? You cannot miss that horrid smell. Well, food scientist Joseph Bell is with us today to explain the science behind why your food goes rancid. In this video, we're going to first of all have Joe review the science so that you understand about fats and rancidity. The second thing we're going to do is talk about the best way to store your food so that you slow down that rancidity process so that you can have the longest shelf life. And I'll give you a sneak peek to that. The first thing you need to do is reduce the temperature. The second is protect your food from light. The third is to protect it from moisture. And the fourth is to protect it from oxygen. If you do that, you can't stop rancidity, but you can definitely slow that process down. And the third thing that we're going to talk about is how important it is to rotate through your food storage, because the healthy fats have a short shelf life. And even if you put all those steps in place, they still are going to have a fairly short shelf life. So join us as we explore the science behind rancidity with our friend, food scientist Joseph Bell. Hey, Provident Preppers, I'm Kylene, and today I am thrilled because we have Joseph Bell, who is a food scientist, with us again today. I have all kinds of questions for him, and he is so amazingly generous to take time to answer our questions. But today, our focus is going to be on rancidity in your stored food. So, Joe, welcome.
Glad to be here. So this presentation is going to be a little bit more complicated, a little more chemistry, just because if I don't do that, you won't understand why things are the way they are. Forgive me if there's more chemistry here than I would normally put into a presentation of this nature. We'll talk about.
I think that's good, Joe, because I think it helps us to understand.
Right, and that's why I'm leaving in more chemistry than I would otherwise. Just as a beginning, you got two types of acids: organic acids and inorganic acids. Inorganic acids are like hydrochloric acid, which we have in our stomach, but also sulfuric acid, nitric, etc. They release hydrogen ions, and the hydrogen ions is what creates the acidic properties. But organic acids are different. Instead of releasing hydrogen ions, they release carboxylic acids. This picture that you're seeing here is what carboxylic acids look like, if you will. The H right here is the what makes it acidic, and the double bond or the single bond between these. The reality is that hydrogen ion bounces between those two bonds at will and rapidly. But this over here, the COOH, that's shorthand for the same thing. And the R, that just means other stuff is attached there. So whenever you see R in a chemical structure, not just me, but almost anybody else as well, that just means other stuff is attached. So what is a fatty acid? A fatty acid is a chain of carbon atoms with a methyl group at one end and a carboxyl group at the other. So my mouse, I'll circle here the methyl group. I said R, and with the CH3, and that's right here, CH3, three hydrogens and one carbon. And at the other end of that chain is our carboxylic acid group with a free hydrogen ion. And because of the rest of the stuff that's attached to it, that's a fairly weak acid, but it's still classified as an acid. This happens to be palmitic acid. It's a chain of 16 carbons. Notice all the hydrogens are present. Every carbon wants to have 4 bonds attached to it. In this case, in the case of palmitic acid, it's saturated with hydrogen atoms. For that reason, it's called a saturated fat, because it's saturated in hydrogen ions. All the possible hydrogen ions that could be there are there. So this is explaining the other part of the same thing. In the end, what we do is we abbreviate it as 16:0 because it's 16 carbon atoms with 0 double bonds. So 16:0 is the abbreviation for no double bonds and the number of atoms that are present. Saturated and unsaturated fats. This is the structure at the bottom of this here is linoleic acid. It's got 18 carbons, 2 double bonds, and everywhere where there's a double bond, it's missing a couple of hydrogens. That makes it an unsaturated fat because it's got 2 double bonds. It's a polyunsaturated fat. This is an omega-6 fatty acid. So what that means is 6 carbons in from this end. That's the first double bond. Omega-6 means 6 carbon atoms in from the omega end of the fatty acid is the first double bond. Every fatty acid has an alpha end. The alpha end is where the carboxyl group is. Remember, alpha is the first letter of the Greek alphabet, alpha, beta, gamma. So these first 3 carbons over here next to the carboxyl group, they're the alpha, beta, and gamma carbons. And the last one is the omega carbon. In this case, 6 carbon atoms in from the omega end is the first double bond, so it's an omega-6 fatty acid. Oleic acid, this is also 18 carbons, but it's only got 1 double bond in it. So it's not polyunsaturated, it's monounsaturated because it's only got 1 double bond. Both of these structures are different ways to illustrate oleic acid. Oleic acid is an omega-9 fatty acid, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 carbons in from the omega end is the first double bond. So it's an omega-9 fatty acid. It's got 18 carbons, so we can abbreviate it as 18:1 because it's 18 carbons and 1 double bond. Notice in this illustration that is trying to be 3-dimensional, you see the carboxyl group is on the left end, it's on the left end over here. So this is the 2 oxygens that we're talking about in this structure. Then there's this kink in it because the double bond creates a bend in the structure. That becomes important, and I'll explain more about that later. That bend in the structure is there whenever you have a double bond. These are 3 space-filling models that are illustrating, my cursor is going to show you for stearic acid, for oleic acid, and for linoleic acid. They all 3 have 18 carbons. Stearic acid has no double bonds, and so it's a saturated fat, and it's straight. Oleic acid has 1 double bond, so it's got 1 kink in it, or a bend in it. And linoleic acid has 2 double bonds, and therefore 2 bends in the structure. This is a summary table that I'll spend just a minute on, and we're only going to look at really 2 columns: the fatty acid abbreviation and the classification of that fatty acid. These all have 0 double bonds, so they are all saturated fats. The number to 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, that's the number of carbons in those structures. Then if you add a single double bond, again, you've got oleic acid, it's monounsaturated, it's an omega-9 fatty acid. These things that are in yellow and highlighted, they are yellow because these are the fatty acids that are essential in the diet. By essential in the diet, I mean your body can't make them, your body really needs them, and the only way your body can get them is if they're in our diet. Anything that's essential in the diet, that's what it means, that the body needs it and can't make enough of it by itself. Linoleic acid, alpha-linolenic acid, arachidonic acid, and EPA and DHA, those are all polyunsaturated fatty acids. All 5 of them are essential in the diet. As you can see, alpha-linolenic acid is an omega-3 fatty acid, whereas linoleic is an omega-6, and you can see these are omega-3 and omega-6. Basically, the body has a hard time making or is not able to make omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids, so they need to be in the diet. If you take some glycerol and add 3 fatty acids to it, you got a triglyceride. About 90% of the fats in the diet are triglycerides. In foods, we're interested in the triglycerides because that's where we get our fatty acids from. As they're digested, the body releases the glycerol, and the body is really good at hoarding things of importance, things that it cannot make. The body holds on to these things till there's no longer a need for them, but at least it holds on to them as long as they're needed. This is a configuration for a triglyceride. And I got to say, in chemistry, we have a hard time getting 3-dimensional structures onto 2-dimensional pages. You can see I drew in a red line here just to say that this part is the glycerol side of the triglyceride, and these are the fatty acids. As you can see down at the bottom here, the top one is palmitic acid, that's 16:0, no double bonds. This one happens to be oleic acid, So 18 carbon atoms, one double bond at the omega-9 end, and alpha linolenic acid again is 18 carbons long with 3 double bonds, and the first one is from the omega end, third carbon in from the end. This is a space-filling model of triglycerides. The thing of importance here is these happen to be unsaturated fats, but it's got what we call a polar end or a water-loving end, and the fatty acids themselves are hydrophobic or water-hating. Hydro meaning water, phobic meaning hate, you've got a phobia for it. So this end of the fatty acids themselves don't like water, but this end up here with the red oxygen molecules, it likes water because it's got hydroxyls there, and they're compatible with water. That's interesting and important because this is the structure of a typical cell membrane. In this illustration, it happens to be a phospholipid, which is 2 fatty acids. It's a diglyceride with a phosphate group on the third end. But that's not the important part. The important part is if you look at the structure here of this membrane, you've got the hydrophilic surface, which is outside the cell. And inside the cell, you've got another hydrophilic surface because of all the hydroxyls of the glycerol that are there. And then putting those two together, you've got a hydrophobic region, which makes up the cell membrane or the shell of that cell. That's what holds the insides in and the outsides out from a given cell. Most of these fatty acids inside here are either monounsaturated or polyunsaturated fatty acids. That's the important part, is that that's where they're used, and the body can make oleic acid, monounsaturated, but the omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids that are in here, the body can't make those. They have to be in the diet. What is a trans fat? Just as background, all double bonds are either cis or they're trans. That's the reality of it, that there's 2 possible configurations for any and all double bonds, cis or trans. The only difference between them is the configuration in space. So look at this. These both happen to be oleic acid. And if you look at the COOH is the carboxylic acid group. CH2, there's 7 of those CH2s there. There's a double bond. And then on the other side of that double bond is 7 more CH2 groups. And then finally, the methyl group, or the CH3. So if you look at this structure, you got this chain coming along here. And then there's a double bond, and it has a fairly strong bend in that structure. Whereas this is the same thing, except half of the structure is on the opposite side of the molecule. So it's a different configuration. And you can see the chain is going out over here and has just really somewhat of a little bend. And then suddenly the chain is going off in the same direction, with just kind of a wrinkle. And that's really all. It's not really a bend, just a wrinkle. The problem is that nutritionally and physiologically, a trans configuration causes the fatty acid to function more like a saturated fat than an unsaturated fat. So this is an unsaturated monoglyceride that's behaving like a saturated fat. And that's a problem, nutritionally and physiologically. Of all of the fats, trans fats are the worst for our health. Too much trans fats in the diet increases the risk of heart disease, inflammation, and heart problems. When people talk about what is the trans fat content, just be aware that the fat is identical to a cis configuration. It's just that it now is almost behaving like a saturated fat. So the FDA in the US requires us manufacturers to label trans fats. The product manufacturer wants to be able to say 0 grams of trans fat. Well, obviously that's always per serving. If they can get the amount of trans fat in a serving down to less than a half a gram, then they can say 0 trans fat. The FDA deals in whole integers, whole numbers. So if it's less than half, it's a 0. That's only an issue if you've got small serving sizes, because it's half a gram per serving. If you've got a large serving, that half a gram may be insignificant. If you got a small serving size, that half a gram could be more significant. So anyway, if you're really concerned about trans fats, read the list of ingredients and avoid partially hydrogenated whatever oil it is, because that's where the trans fats are located. So talk about rancidity now.
Okay, so that rancidity, the reason why it's so important to us is because it ruins our stored food.
That's right.
Right?
I'm going to digress for a moment. Rancidity is not toxic in general. It tastes disgusting. It may make you throw up. I had a friend in grad school that he had a project working on turkey fat, and it was really, really rancid. And he got really, really sick. Now, that wasn't a toxic problem. It was just absolutely disgusting. That's a 2,000-foot overview of rancidity. So light, any kind of light, likes to convert molecular oxygen into free radicals. And by the way, sunlight does that more than room light. Bright room light does that more than dim room light. The worst case scenario is ultraviolet light from the sun. It will.
So we want to make sure that we keep our food in a dark place. That's the take home.
Yes, and the darker, the better. But we'll talk more about that here in just a second. When free radicals react with fatty acids, they react near the double bonds. This next sentence is important. Free radicals are about 20 times more likely to react at or near the double bonds of an unsaturated fat than with a saturated fat. Consequently, the shelf life of unsaturated fatty acids is significantly shorter than that of saturated fats. That's an important point. We all need polyunsaturated fatty acids, but they're not the stable part of the fat. Saturated fats are stable, are much more stable. Don't worry about the chemistry here. Let me summarize. Rancidity has three phases: initiation, propagation, and termination. The initiation phase of developing rancidity runs very, very slowly. It doesn't start very quickly at all. But with light, if this is the fat, unsaturated fat, or lipid, that's the same thing. The light oxidizes some oxygen to create it goes through initiation, and that creates a radical lipid. It's not on the double bond, it's on actually the methylene group right next to it. But if that double bond wasn't there, it wouldn't be attracted to this area at all. Then combine that with some more oxygen, and you get a peroxyl group, peroxyl radical here. Then that peroxyl radical reacts with another piece of fat, and you've got a cyclical process that once this starts, it will continue. It doesn't start very quickly, but once it starts, it's autocatalytic. In other words, it'll run itself. It doesn't need any more light because it's got a peroxyl group, and that is the engine that will run the reaction and will continue to run the reaction. So eventually it runs out of stuff to react with, and you go through a termination phase. The thing to remember here is the initiation phase starts slowly. But once it starts, it will just keep running. And that is I'll say later on that rancid fat catalyzes rancid fat. And this is why. The double bonds on an unsaturated fatty acid can also be cleaved by free radical reactions involving molecular oxygen. In other words, it can be split apart. This forms some aldehydes and some ketones that taste bad. This is a different reaction that fatty acids can go through, primarily unsaturated fatty acids. It doesn't require light, but it does require oxygen. And finally, bacteria or molds can, that type of rancidity refers to water-dependent process in which microorganisms such as bacteria and molds use lipases, which the bacteria produce, to break down the fat. So your product can be pasteurized to kill the bacteria, or you can add some antioxidants to it to stop this process. But this is a separate type of rancidity caused by bacteria or molds. How do you deal with this? The manufacturer can add antioxidants. They are ingredients that stop or slow the food from becoming rancid. Examples of natural fatty acids are like vitamin E, which is alpha tocopherol, and vitamin C, which is ascorbic acid. The challenge is natural antioxidants are short-lived. They don't last long. So if we need a longer shelf life, the manufacturer, not the consumer, can add some synthetic antioxidants. And those would include BHA, BHT, TBHQ, and propylgallate. They only add tiny amounts of this. Regulatory law only allows, for example, a maximum of 0.02% TBHQ. They don't need much more than that. and they won't add any more than that. That is the legal limit for TBHQ, at least. If an antioxidant is added in any amount, U.S. federal law requires for those ingredients to be in the ingredient legend or list of ingredients. If there's no antioxidants in the list of ingredients, there were none added. If there is some added and they're not on the label, that's a recall. And that's a bad thing. Everybody avoids that. The unfortunate reality, those fatty acids that are of the greatest importance nutritionally are also the fatty acids that are the least stable chemically. That's a problem. All fatty acids that are essential in the diet are polyunsaturated, and polyunsaturated fatty acids are significantly less stable than saturated fats or solid fats. How do you deal with that? Rotate the product. That's really all you can do. So how to reduce rancidity? Number one, store the product where it is cool. We've had a previous video that talks about the effect of temperature. And briefly, I'll just explain that every shelf life assumes a temperature and humidity for that product. Typically in the range, it's room temperature. So like 73 degrees Fahrenheit, about 50% humidity for storage. If the consumer puts the product in an area that's 18 degrees above that condition, so instead of being 73 degrees Fahrenheit, it's 91 degrees Fahrenheit, assuming the product had a shelf life of 20 years, there's a factor of 2 to 3 there. So divide the 20 by 2 or 3. So your shelf life is now between 6 2/3 and 10 years instead of the 20 years because of temperature alone. So you don't want to store your stuff in higher temperatures. The product needs to be dry, obviously. Moisture catalyzes rancidity. A tiny bit of water is like an ocean for a microorganism. A tiny bit of water also speeds up oxidative rancidity, which is initiated by light and or oxygen. Store the product in the dark, but I have to add that my wife was brilliant. She puts all of our food storage fats and oils in a cardboard box and keeps a lid on it. Label the box. It doesn't have to be in a dark room, but put it inside a closed box. Avoid exposing the product to oxygen and use oxygen absorbers. Ensure the product is packaged in sanitary conditions. Get rid of the microorganisms. Avoid contact with metals, and I would say especially iron, copper, and nickel, because those are the metals that catalyze oxidation. There are types of stainless steel. They may make you sick, but they're not going to give you cancer. They could give you cancer, but only if you get carried away. So if they taste bad, throw it away. But
so one of our viewers had asked me a question. She said, if I buy oil, for instance, in a plastic jug, can I transfer it to a glass mason jar, or will that shorten the shelf life because you have compromised the original seal? What's your thought on that?
2 or 3 thoughts. Number one, opening it and pouring it from A to B incorporates oxygen. Bad idea. You want to keep it in the dark. I would just leave it in the current container because that'll minimize exposure to oxygen, and put it inside of a box. The seals, we've got double seals on the Mylar. They do not overlap. They are not wrinkled. They are not overheated. If you burn one of those seals, it's not going to be a good protection against the environment. You want to melt that without burning it. And we always do 2 seals, one on top of the other, without them overlapping, because at the junction between the 2, it could melt and you would not have a good seal. Also, a pinhole in a Mylar bag can reduce the shelf life of that product. For example, in a Mylar bag of powdered milk, you can have powdered milk that could last for 20 years, but with a pinhole, it's down to about 3 to 6 months.
So how do I know for sure if I have a pinhole?
Look, that's all you can do.
Okay, so if I have a pinhole, is it still will it let the air escape?
It'll let the oxygen in and moisture in. That's the issue.
So if I'm pushing on my Mylar bag and it feels like it's okay, that doesn't necessarily mean it is.
Look at the bag. Make sure there's no pinholes. That's all.
Am I looking with a light or just visually?
That's all I would do, is just visually look at it.
Okay.
By the way, on powdered milk, when it gets old, it's agglomerated pieces of powdered milk stuck together. And that's why it has really good solubility. If it gets old, some of those pieces fall off, and suddenly you have powdered milk that doesn't dissolve anymore. That's a problem. You get lumpy milk. Plus, the proteins of the milk start absorbing off flavors. So you start getting oxidized off flavors. Next bullet point says, ensure the packaging provides protection from light and is a good moisture barrier and is a good oxygen barrier. And even if there's an oxygen absorber being added, you still need a good oxygen barrier there. Otherwise, the oxygen absorber is just going to get overwhelmed. The next bullet, prevent cross-contamination with older rancid fats. If you really like a given container and that container contains rancid fats, if you pour out the old oil and pour in new, that new stuff is going to go rancid fairly quickly, simply because initiation has already been completed. They're into the propagation cyclical reaction, and a tiny molecule of rancid fat is going to catalyze the rancidification of everything else present.
So we would never want to combine two bottles.
Correct. And if you do have a container that you really like to use for whatever reason, wash it, dry it completely, make sure it's totally dry. Then you can reuse it, but get rid of all the old fat first. And finally, antioxidants can slow or stop oxidation. I was just going to mention, a lot of nutritional supplements are in gelatin capsules. Gelatin is a really good protection for oxidation. So just a data point. Believe the shelf life on the package. If the product is generally dry, you might go a few weeks past that and be safe, but not a lot. And you can always taste the product. Okay, signs of rancidity. If the oil changes color, if it's no longer yellow, like this is corn oil, it's nice and yellow. If it ceases to be yellow or if it starts to become clear, it's rancid. Another data point, if your bottle starts to shrink, to collapse, to kind of implode, the product is oxidizing. Oxidation consumes oxygen. And so the product inside starts to consume less space. So the package tends to implode or to shrink or shrivel a little bit. That's a sign of oxidation. If that happens, open the product, taste it. If it's still palatable, use it up. If you've opened it up, you have to use it up. But if it's representative of lots of others that are in the same condition, just recognize that oxidation is starting. And the only question is it now so far that you can no longer tolerate eating it anymore?
So theoretically, if I were to heat that oil, would it stop the rancidity?
No, it'd make it worse.
It would make it worse.
Temperature controls chemistry. It doesn't reverse it. If you really want to save something, freeze it. Temperature still controls chemistry. And no matter what the chemistry is, it's never going to reverse it, but you can slow it way down. 18 degrees Fahrenheit increase in temperature, you've got half to a third the shelf life. On the other hand, if it's 18 degrees below room temperature, then you've doubled the shelf life. And you wonder, well, gee, this stuff that's in my garage, what's it like? Well, you figure for every day it aged 2 to 3 days because of increased temperature, it's going to go rancid faster. And that's the case for all chemistry. And unfortunately, the degradation is irreversible. This is a complicated area. People are going to have lots and lots of questions. We'll do what we can between you and me to answer a few of them. But honestly, Wikipedia is a marvelous source. These are a few of the articles that are on Wikipedia on this topic. There's a lot of others too. There's at least 4 or 5 times as many as I'm listing here. Within each of those articles are links and references that'll give you a whole lot more information. Anyway, I'm a fan of Wikipedia because my textbooks are of ancient date, and Wikipedia is far more up to date than my old textbooks.
Joe, thank you so much. That was a little bit overwhelming, but very, very informative. So
yeah, I'm sorry if it's overwhelming, but you think you have to understand the chemistry to understand what the heck they're talking about.
That's why we need brains like you. So for food storage, what fats would you store that have the longest shelf life? What would you recommend on your list of fats? If you could store 4 fats or oils, what would they be?
The issue is not stability. The issue is nutrition. If you store something that does not give you the essential nutrients that keep your body healthy, then you're going to be sick.
Give me the 4 that will store the longest and the 4 that you think would be best nutritionally.
Nutritionally, I would look at 3 oils that are the most essential in the diet, and because of that, they're the least stable, and the only way you're going to store them is by rotating them. Olive oil, corn oil, and soybean oil. They have the highest levels of unsaturated fats and polyunsaturated fats. But as far as what would store the best, I'm thinking of Crisco oil. I happen to have one of these here. This stores really well. Believe the end date there, but again, the story is if you can taste it and it doesn't taste bad, it won't make you sick.
Crisco is something that I bought and stuck away, but I don't use it in my regular cooking. It was, I don't know, like 10 or 11 years old, and I was inspecting all my stuff, and the Crisco had actually leaked through that cardboard kind of container that it's in. But when I opened it, it didn't smell bad, but the container was compromised before the life of the oil. Weird.
You're going to have a mess if you continue to store it. It'll just damage your shelf. Positional distribution of individual fatty acids in triglycerides in some natural fats. These are the abbreviations of the fatty acids that we talked about. This graph does not show omegas, but it does show unsaturation. So 2 double bonds, 1 double bond, and these over here. So peanuts they're good for linolenic acid. That's linolenic. This is oleic acid. It's monounsaturated. It's not essential. This is essential in the diet. So peanuts are good. I would say peanut oil would be the same. This is the fat in them. And you can see soybean oil is relatively high. And you're thinking, well, this doesn't add up to 100%. These add up to 100% along this way. If you can see the way I'm moving my cursor. Corn oil, soybean oil, cocoa butter. You know, the thing about cocoa butter, chocolate, it's a very narrow range of types of oil. And so nutritionally, it's good. It has a very sharp melt point because there's not a large distribution like cow's milk. It's got a huge distribution. And so it melts at all kinds of different temperatures. That is, the fats do. So corn oil, soybean oil, olive oil, peanut oil is also good. And then it shows beef and pig fat and their fatty acid distribution. This adds peanut oil to that list that I mentioned earlier. But because they're nutritionally good, they're not going to have good shelf life.
That was super interesting, Joe. I like the cocoa butter thing. I might have to store more cocoa butter. Me and my chocolate, I think. Thank you for coming and sharing with us and helping us to understand this. I think that the bottom line with everything that we learned today is that we need to rotate. Anything that has fat, it's best to rotate it. We need to store it as cool as possible and dark. And when appropriate, use oxygen absorbers. And, you know, you're not going to stick an oxygen absorber in your bottle of olive oil. Let's be clear about that. We're talking about talking about the fats that are in dry goods. That rotate. Is there anything else you want to add at the end here?
With light, again, cardboard boxes are a great place to put fats and oils with the lid and label. Anytime you take product A and container A and put the product into container B, you've added oxygen. It's a bad idea. It's not going to help you.
Thank you, Joe. We so very appreciate you and on your knowledge and your willingness to share it with us.
Glad to help.
So for our audience out there, for the question of the day, what is your favorite oil to store, or fat that you store in food storage? And what do you do to extend that shelf life so that it can be good for longer? Comment below. And thanks for being part of the solution.